A bread roll hit marble at her feet. The billionaire looked down. Torn sneakers, donated dress, black skin.
Your kind washes dishes and scrubs floors. You don't belong near this piano.
300 guests laughed. Not one spoke up. She said nothing, walked to the Steinway, sat down, adjusted the bench. One precise, practiced motion no one expected from a girl like her. 3 notes, just 3, and every laugh in that room died. The shelter on West Madison Street smelled the way forgotten places always do. Bleach over mildew, instant coffee over despair. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a yellowish glow across rows of cots lined up side by side, tight even, like piano keys. Delilah Brooks slept on the 3rd cot from the wall. She was 18 years old. She had been homeless for 2 years. Everything she owned fit inside one backpack. A Bible with a cracked leather spine, her grandmother's. A pair of fingerless gloves, hand-knitted, the yarn faded to the color of old smoke. She wore them everywhere, indoors, outdoors, even in summer. Not because she was cold, because they were the last thing Ida Brooks ever made with her hands. Ida raised Delilah alone. No mother. She disappeared when Delilah was 4, left nothing behind but a name on a birth certificate. No father, just Ida. A woman with a bad hip, a church hat collection, and 40 years of playing piano every Sunday morning at Grace Calvary Baptist on the south side of Chicago. That church was Delilah's whole world. Every Sunday, she sat on Ida's lap at the piano bench, tiny fingers reaching for keys too wide for her hands. By 3, she could pick out melodies by ear. By 5, she was playing hymns, not reading them, feeling them. Her fingers just knew where to go, the way a river knows how to find the sea. By 8, she was playing Chopin. By 12, Debussy. Ida couldn't explain it. She'd played piano her whole life, and she was good, solid, faithful, dependable. But Delilah was something else. Something that made the old women in the front pew close their eyes and grip the edges of their seats. Something that made grown men cry without knowing why. Ida scraped together every spare dollar she had and found a teacher. Not just any teacher. Professor Elaine Mercer, retired faculty from Juilliard, living quietly in a modest apartment on the South Side, taking on a handful of students for almost nothing. The first time Mercer heard Delilah play, she sat completely still for a long time afterward. Then she looked at Ida and said 5 words that changed everything. This child speaks through piano. For 4 years, Mercer poured everything she had into Delilah. Theory, technique, interpretation, emotion. She pushed her harder than any student she'd ever taught, because she'd never heard anyone like her. Then Ida died. A Tuesday in November. Heart attack at the kitchen table. The coffee was still warm when the paramedics arrived. Delilah was 16. After the funeral, the piano was sold. $200. That was the price of 30 years of music, of every Sunday morning, of Ida's voice saying, "One more time, baby, one more time." $200 didn't even cover the burial. Delilah entered the foster care system. 2 homes in 18 months. The first family was indifferent. The second was worse. The father made comments about her skin color when he drank, which was often. She learned to stay invisible. She learned to eat fast and sleep light. The day she turned 18, the system released her. That was the word they used, released, like she was a fish thrown back into water. Except there was no water, just concrete, just Chicago winter, just a girl with a backpack and nowhere to go. She found the shelter on West Madison. She found a job washing dishes at Gus Brennan's Diner, a narrow, greasy place on Halsted Street that smelled of burnt oil and onion rings. The shift ran from 10 at night to 4 in the morning. Minimum wage, no benefits, no conversation. Gus was decent enough, paid on time, didn't ask questions, didn't look at her twice. To him, she was just the quiet girl in the back who never complained. Her hands told two stories now. The calluses on her fingertips, hard, specific, in places only a pianist would recognize. Those were Ida's legacy. But layered over them were newer marks, small burns from scalding water, cracks from industrial soap, the rough, raw hands of a dishwasher. 2 years without a real piano. She practiced when she could. There was a keyboard in the shelter's rec room. Donated, old, 3 keys dead. She played it with headphones on, late at night, after her shift. Sometimes she walked to Millennium Park and played the public piano there, fingers moving fast before someone told her to move along. But a keyboard with dead keys and a public piano in the wind, those weren't the same as a real instrument. And she knew it. Her hands knew it too. She had applied for a scholarship audition at the Chicago Conservatory of Music. The audition was 9 days away. A full ride. The kind of chance that comes once, maybe twice, in a lifetime. But she had no piano to practice on, no money for proper clothes, and 2 years of silence in her fingers that scared her more than anything. The runs she used to fly through, would her hands still remember? The soft passages that needed fingertips like velvet, could hands wrecked by dish soap still produce that sound? If she missed this audition, the next intake was 2 years away. By then she'd be 20, and 20 felt like a door closing. That was Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, Terry Adams, a volunteer at the shelter, mid-40s, kind eyes, the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, sat down next to her at breakfast. "Dee, you hear about the gala tonight? Drake Hotel, Carlton Whitfield's charity thing. His foundation gives grants to young people. I got your name on the wait list." Delilah looked at him over her coffee. "I don't have anything to wear." "We'll figure it out." "I don't belong in a place like that, Terry." He leaned forward, looked her straight in the eye. "It's not about begging, Dee. You walk in, you tell them who you are. That's all." She didn't say yes, not right away. But that afternoon, she stood in the shelter bathroom, staring at herself in a cracked mirror. The dress Terry found in the donation bin was black, 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a thin belt. Her sneakers were the only shoes she had, worn, a small tear near the left toe. She looked at her reflection and knew the truth. She didn't look like she belonged at the Drake Hotel. She didn't look like she belonged anywhere. But she looked down at her hands, Ida's gloves, the calluses underneath, the burns from last night's shift, and thought, I'm 18. Nobody's coming to save me. There is no next time. If you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. Stay with me. The Drake Hotel ballroom looked like it had been built to remind ordinary people they didn't matter. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with gold leaf. White orchids spilled from vases on every table. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Background music for people who considered live musicians furniture. The air smelled of truffle canapes, expensive cologne, and the quiet arrogance of old money pretending to care about the poor. 300 guests. Tech founders, hedge fund managers, real estate dynasties. The women wore gowns that cost more than a year of Delilah's rent, if she'd had rent to pay. The men wore watches that could feed the entire West Madison shelter for a month. And at the center of it all, Carlton Whitfield III. He arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, not because he was punctual, because he liked making a room wait just long enough to notice when he walked in. 2 assistants flanked him. A personal photographer trailed behind, catching every handshake, every smile, every carefully staged moment of generosity. Whitfield was mid-50s, silver hair swept back like a news anchor, a tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit him the way power, fits the people who've never had to earn it. His cufflinks were monogrammed. His shoes were Italian. His smile reached his mouth, but never his eyes. He shook hands with a grip that lasted 1 second too long, just enough to remind you who was in control. He spoke to waiters without looking at them. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny because he was the one who told them. Forbes had profiled him twice. He'd given 3 TED Talks, all about meritocracy, hard work, the American dream. His foundation slogan was printed on every banner in the ballroom: "Earn your place." The irony was thick enough to choke on. Carlton Whitfield III had inherited $80 million from his father before he ever earned a single cent. The fintech company that made him a billionaire was built on that inheritance. Seed money he'd never had to beg for, borrowed from a fortune he'd never had to build. But he stood on stages and told poor people to pull themselves up. His charity galas were famous, not for generosity, for performance. Every year, Whitfield's foundation awarded opportunity grants to underprivileged young people. The winners were paraded on stage, asked to thank him publicly, photographed beside him for the annual report. They were props in his story of greatness, living proof that Carlton Whitfield cared, displayed like trophies behind glass. A woman at a nearby table, old money, pearls, Connecticut accent, leaned toward her husband. "Isn't it wonderful what Carlton does for these people?" Her husband nodded without looking up from his phone. Near the back of the ballroom, a man sat at the Steinway Model D concert grand. Nathan Holloway, black, early 30s, classically trained at Northwestern, good enough for concert halls, but paying rent with gigs like this. Background music at rich people's parties. He played Debussy softly, the notes dissolving into the noise of clinking glasses and hollow laughter. Whitfield walked past the piano without a glance at Nathan. Not a nod, not a look. He leaned toward an aide and said, loud enough for Nathan to hear, "Tell the piano guy to keep it soft. Background noise, not a concert." The piano guy. Not the pianist. Not the musician. The piano guy. Nathan's jaw tightened. His fingers didn't stop. But something in his posture shifted. The way a man's back straightens when he swallows something he'll remember later. That was the world Carlton Whitfield had built. A world where black hands played the music and white hands took the credit, where talent served and money sat. Then Delilah walked in. Terry brought her through the side entrance, the service door, because, of course, the wait list didn't come with a front door invitation. She stepped into the ballroom and stopped. The noise hit her first, then the light, then the smell, perfume and wine and food she couldn't name. She stood near the wall, hands in her pockets, shoulders drawn in, trying to take up as little space as possible. The donated dress hung loose on her frame. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished floor. But her eyes went straight to the piano. The Steinway Model D, 9 feet of concert-grade perfection. Black lacquer so polished it reflected the chandeliers. She could see the keys from across the room, 88 of them, gleaming white and black, waiting. Her fingers twitched inside her pockets. Involuntary. The way a musician's body responds before the mind catches up. 2 years without a real instrument, and still, her hands remembered what they were made for. Whitfield's gaze swept the room. It landed on her for half a second. His brow creased. He turned to an aide and said something. The aide nodded and began walking toward Delilah. 2 worlds were about to collide, and neither one was ready. The aide reached Delilah in 4 steps, young, blonde, clipboard in hand. He looked at her the way people look at a stain on a white tablecloth. "Are you with the catering staff?" Delilah kept her voice steady. "No, I'm on the wait list. For the grant. The aide glanced at his clipboard, flipped a page, found her name. His eyebrows lifted, just slightly, just enough to say everything without saying anything. Wait here. He walked back to Whitfield, leaned in, whispered. Whitfield turned and looked at Delilah across the room, a long, slow look, the kind a man gives something he's already decided isn't worth his time. Then he walked toward her. The crowd noticed. Conversations dimmed. Heads turned. Whitfield moved through the room like a man walking through his own living room, because to him, it was. He stopped 3 feet from Delilah, close enough for her to smell his cologne, close enough for every nearby table to hear every word. His eyes started at her sneakers, moved up, the too big dress, the thin belt, the fingerless gloves. He didn't try to hide it. He studied her the way a man studies something that wandered in from the wrong side of a fence. And you are? Delilah Brooks. I'm here for the opportunity grant. I see, he smiled. The kind of smile that makes you feel smaller. And what exactly is your talent? I play piano. The silence that followed lasted 2 seconds. Then Whitfield laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not at first, a dismissive laugh. The laugh of a man who genuinely found the idea amusing. He turned to the nearest table, playing for his audience. Did you hear that? She plays piano. He gestured toward the Steinway without looking at it. That instrument costs more than every building on your block combined, assuming your kind even has a block to go back to. A few guests chuckled. Some looked away. One woman adjusted her napkin and stared at her plate. Whitfield turned back to Delilah. He picked up a bread roll from the nearest table, held it up between 2 fingers like a prop. Then he tossed it at her feet. It bounced once on the marble and rolled to a stop against her torn sneaker. If you can't play, you don't eat. That's how civilization works, sweetheart. Especially for your kind. The words hit the room like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Some guests laughed, the nervous, ugly kind of laughter that comes from people too comfortable to feel shame. Others said nothing. Not one person stood up. Not one person said stop. Vivian Caldwell, a society columnist seated 2 tables away, set down her champagne glass. Her hand moved to her phone. She pressed record. She said nothing. Nathan Holloway sat frozen at the piano bench. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle in his cheek jumped. His hands hovered above the keys. He wanted to stand. He wanted to say something. But he had rent due Friday and no other gig lined up. So he sat there and hated himself for it. A man in a gray suit leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Someone should say something." His wife shook her head once. Quick, final, the universal gesture of, "Don't get involved." That was the room. 300 powerful people, and not a single spine among them. Delilah looked down at the bread roll at her feet. Her eyes burned. Her hands shook at her sides. Not from cold, not from fear, but from something deeper. The kind of trembling that comes right before a person either breaks or becomes unbreakable. She thought about walking out. She knew where the service door was. 10 steps, maybe 12. She could disappear the same way she came in, invisible, unnoticed. Another black girl who didn't belong. She'd been thrown out before. Foster care taught her that. The second home, the one with the father who drank, he used the same word, your kind. She survived that. She survived the system releasing her at 18 with nothing. She survived 2 years of shelters and dish soap and silence. But this was different. This wasn't behind closed doors. This was 300 people watching a man throw bread at her feet and laugh. This was public. This was the world telling her, to her face, that she was nothing. Whitfield wasn't done. He was enjoying himself now. The room was his stage, and Delilah was the punchline. He raised his voice, made sure the whole room could hear. Tell you what, play something, right now. Impress me, and I'll personally write you a grant check tonight. He leaned closer. But if it's embarrassing, and let's be honest, it will be, security walks you out. Fair? The room murmured. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto an 18-year-old girl in a donated dress with a bread roll at her feet. Does she dare? And if she dares, after 2 years away from a real piano, with hands roughened by dish soap and steel wool, can she deliver? The room waited. Delilah stood perfectly still, the bread roll at her feet. The laughter is still hanging in the air like smoke. 300 faces watching her, some amused, some embarrassed, none willing to help. She could leave. The service door was right there. She could walk out, go back to the shelter, clock in at the diner at 10, and wash dishes until 4 in the morning like she did every night. Nobody in this room would remember her name by dessert. But then she heard it. Not a sound in the ballroom. A sound in her memory. Ida's voice, low and warm, the way it always sounded during Sunday afternoon lessons in their tiny apartment. The smell of coffee and furniture polish. The upright piano with the chipped middle C. Ida's hands over hers, guiding her fingers to the right keys. Baby, the piano don't care what you look like. It only knows what you feel. Delilah looked at her hands. Ida's fingerless gloves. Underneath, calluses layered on calluses. The old ones from piano keys, the new ones from steel wool and scalding water. Hands that hadn't touched a grand piano in 2 years. Hands that might not remember. She thought about the scholarship audition. 9 days, no instrument, no teacher, no money. If she walked out now, that audition would come and go, and she'd still be washing dishes at 4 in the morning, at 20, at 25, at 30. She thought about the foster care system that raised her and then threw her away. The second foster father who called her your kind when he was drunk. The caseworker who signed her release papers without looking up. Everyone had always made the decision for her. When to stay, when to go, when to disappear. Not tonight. She didn't announce anything, didn't give a speech, didn't look at Whitfield. She just moved. One step, then another, toward the Steinway. Nathan Holloway saw her coming. Their eyes met across 10 feet of polished marble. He read something in her face. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter. Something that made him stand without thinking and yield the bench. Delilah sat down. The bench was warm from Nathan. She adjusted the height. One smooth, precise motion. Professional, automatic. The kind of thing you don't learn from YouTube tutorials. The kind of thing 1,000 hours of training puts into your bones. The room noticed. A few people exchanged glances. She placed her fingers on the keys. Then she stopped, pulled off the fingerless gloves, set them on top of the piano, gently, carefully, the way you place flowers on a grave. Underneath, her bare hands, scarred, burned, calloused. She closed her eyes, drew one breath. The piano would speak for her. The only question was, after 2 years of silence, would it still remember her voice? The first note came out like a whisper. Chopin, Ballade No. 1 in G minor. One of the most technically demanding, emotionally devastating pieces ever written for piano. Concert professionals have stumbled on it. Juilliard graduates have wept over it. Judges at international competitions have watched careers end on its runs. An 18-year-old homeless girl chose it in a room full of billionaires who expected her to fail. The opening was simple, a single line of melody, unaccompanied, rising from silence like a voice calling across an empty room. 3 notes, G, then B flat, then D. Bare, exposed, nowhere to hide. 3 notes, that's all it took. 3 notes, and 300 people forgot how to breathe. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth at table 6. A waiter froze mid-step, his tray tilted at an angle that should have sent champagne glasses crashing to the floor. A woman at the front table, diamonds at her throat, $6,000 on her wrist, opened her mouth slightly and didn't close it. The room didn't go quiet because people chose silence. The room went quiet because the sound coming from that piano reached into their chests and squeezed. Whitfield's smirk was still on his face, but it had stopped moving, frozen in place like a mask that no longer fit. He didn't know what he was hearing yet, but his body did. His hand, which had been reaching for his champagne glass, hung in the air and didn't land. Delilah's hands trembled. She felt it in the first runs, the first transitions. Her ring finger on the left hand was half a beat late on a descending passage. Her right thumb hit a note with too much force, a small spike in a phrase that should have been silk. 2 years of absence. 2 years of dead keys and public pianos and dish soap eating away at the softness in her fingertips. She was terrified. But the notes didn't lie. Even imperfect, even trembling, each one carried something that technique alone cannot produce. Intention, grief, a kind of desperate tenderness that made the imperfection sound deliberate, the way a crack in a voice makes a singer sound more human, not less. Nathan Holloway stood against the wall, arms crossed. He had recognized the piece from the first bar. His eyes widened. He leaned forward slightly, then caught himself and leaned back, crossing his arms tighter. The posture of a musician who knows he is witnessing something that doesn't happen twice in a lifetime. He whispered to no one, "She's playing the first ballade." A server near him frowned. "Is that hard?" Nathan didn't look away from Delilah's hands. "It's impossible." Then something shifted. It happened around the 42nd bar, the transition from the opening theme to the second subject, a passage that requires the left hand to carry a rolling bass while the right hand sings a melody so lyrical it sounds like a human voice. Delilah's left hand found its rhythm, not gradually, suddenly, like a key turning in a lock. The muscle memory that had been buried under 2 years of dish soap and steel wool and survival, it broke through. Not gently, it erupted. Her wrists lifted, her shoulders dropped, her back straightened. The trembling stopped. And what came out of that piano was no longer the sound of a girl trying to remember. It was the sound of a girl who never forgot. The second theme of Chopin's first ballade is one of the most beautiful melodies ever written. It rises and falls like breathing. It aches without explaining why. Pianists spend years trying to make it sing, trying to find that exact balance between restraint and release, between holding back and letting go. Delilah didn't try. She just played. And she played it like she was talking to someone who wasn't there. She was talking to Ida. Every note was a word she never got to say. Every phrase was a Sunday afternoon in that tiny apartment, coffee on the counter, Ida's hands guiding hers. The melody climbed, and Delilah climbed with it. Eyes closed, body swaying, tears running down her face without a sound. The room changed. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, irreversible moments. A man at table 12 set down his champagne glass and didn't pick it up again. A woman in emerald gripped her husband's arm. Two guests at the back stood up, not to leave, but because sitting felt insufficient. Vivian Caldwell had stopped recording. She was holding her phone, but she wasn't looking at the screen. She was crying. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in thin black lines. She would later write in her column, "I came to cover a gala. I witnessed something holy." Nathan Holloway's eyes were wet. He pressed his back harder against the wall, arms still crossed, chin lifted, the way men hold themselves when they're trying not to fall apart in public. He had trained for years. He had played this piece himself, in practice rooms and recitals and empty auditoriums. He had never heard it sound like this. Somewhere across Chicago, in a modest apartment with a cat on the windowsill and stacks of sheet music on every surface, Professor Elaine Mercer was asleep in her armchair. She didn't know what was happening at the Drake Hotel. She didn't know that the girl she had poured 4 years of her life into was sitting at a Steinway concert grand, playing from memory, playing from grief, playing from a place so deep that technique was no longer the point. If she could have heard it, she would have known. Every hour, every sacrifice, every time she told Ida, "This child is special. Don't let the world take that from her." It was all alive in that room. 2 years of silence hadn't killed it. Nothing could. The ballad built toward its famous climactic section. The music shifted, darker, faster, more urgent. Cascading arpeggios that tumble like water over rocks. Octave runs that require hands to stretch and strike with a force that borders on violence. Thunderous chords that shake the instrument's frame. This is where professionals falter. This is where good pianists become careful and great pianists become fearless. Delilah became fearless. Her hands attacked the keys with a ferocity that made the nearest guests flinch. The sound was enormous, filling the ballroom from floor to ceiling, drowning out every whisper, every clink, every breath. The Steinway wasn't background noise anymore. It was the only voice in the room. And her hands. Those hands that scrubbed plates and scoured pots 6 hours ago. They didn't just keep up. They commanded. Every burn, every callus, every crack in her skin had made them stronger, not weaker. 2 years of manual labor hadn't destroyed her technique. It had forged something underneath it. An endurance, a relentlessness, a refusal to break that Chopin himself might have recognized. The climax thundered through the ballroom. A woman covered her ears, not from pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of it. A man at table 3 was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, knuckles white, mouth open. Then the coda. The final passage of Chopin's first ballade is one of the most devastating endings in all of piano literature. It comes after the storm, after the fury and the fire, and it descends, slowly, gently, like the last breath of someone letting go. Delilah played it with a softness that made the air feel sacred. Her body swayed. Tears ran freely now, not the quiet tears from before, but the kind that come when something locked inside you for 2 years finally finds a way out. She didn't wipe them. She didn't stop. She played the descending passage like she was laying Ida to rest one final time, like she was saying goodbye, not with words, because words had never been enough, but with the only language she and her grandmother ever truly shared. The last chord. Her hands lifted from the keys. Slowly. She held them there, suspended above the ivory, as if releasing a bird. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. The longest silence the Drake Hotel ballroom had ever held. No clink of glass. No murmur. No movement. 300 people. People who built empires, who moved markets, who shaped policy. sat completely still, undone by an 18-year-old girl in a donated dress. Then one person clapped, a single pair of hands, somewhere near the back. Slow, deliberate. Then another, and another. And then the room detonated. 300 people on their feet. Not polite applause, the kind of ovation that comes from the gut, raw and uncontrollable. Some people were clapping so hard their palms stung. Some were crying openly, men and women who hadn't cried in years, standing in their evening wear with tears running down their faces, clapping for a girl they wouldn't have looked at 20 minutes ago. Nathan Holloway was clapping so hard his hands hurt. He was laughing and crying at the same time, the way musicians do when they hear something that reminds them why they chose this life. Delilah sat frozen on the bench. She didn't stand. She didn't bow. She looked at the fingerless gloves on top of the piano, Ida's gloves, resting on the Steinway like a quiet offering. And for the first time that night, she smiled. Small, exhausted. The smile of someone who had just found something she thought she'd lost forever. The applause kept going. It wasn't stopping. It wasn't fading into polite silence the way applause does at charity events. It was growing, feeding on itself, rolling through the ballroom like a wave that didn't know how to break. And in the middle of it all, Carlton Whitfield III stood completely still. His hands hung at his sides. He was not clapping. His face had traveled a journey in the last 8 minutes. Smirk to confusion, confusion to disbelief. Disbelief to something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Fear. Not the fear of danger, the fear of irrelevance. The fear of a man who has spent his entire life buying rooms and just watched an 18-year-old girl with nothing take one from him with 3 notes and the truth. The guests around him were on their feet, applauding, weeping, looking at Delilah with the kind of awe they usually reserve for quarterly earnings reports and IPO announcements. No one was looking at Whitfield. No one was thanking him. No one was posing for his photographer. For the first time in his life, Carlton Whitfield was standing in a room he paid for, surrounded by people he'd invited, and he was invisible. A woman 2 tables away leaned toward her companion. She didn't whisper. She didn't need to. The applause was loud enough to cover it. But Whitfield heard every word. Maybe she should be the one writing grants. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his neck pulsed. His photographer lowered his camera. Even the man paid to make Whitfield look good knew there was nothing worth capturing on that face. The applause began to soften, not because the room was done, because Delilah was moving. She stood up from the bench, slowly, the way someone stands after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. She picked up the fingerless gloves from the top of the piano, held them in both hands for a moment, gently, the way you hold something sacred. Then she turned and looked at Carlton Whitfield. Not with anger, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of revenge. With calm, the calm of a girl who had survived foster care at 16, homelessness at 18, 2 years of invisible labor, and a man throwing bread at her feet in front of 300 strangers. The calm of someone who had already endured worse than anything this man could ever do. She walked toward him. The room went quiet again. 300 people held their breath for the second time that night. She stopped, close enough to see the sweat forming along his hairline, close enough to watch his eyes search for something to say and find nothing. She looked him straight in the face. "You said if I can't play, I don't eat." Her voice was steady, low, not a shout, not a whisper. The exact volume of someone who doesn't need to raise her voice because every person in the room is already listening. I played. A pause. One beat. But I didn't come here for your food, Mr. Whitfield. I came here to remind you that talent doesn't have a dress code. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She turned and walked toward the exit, the same service door she'd entered through. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the marble. The donated dress swayed with each step. The fingerless gloves were back on her hands. The room erupted again. Not just applause this time. Voices. Cheers. The raw, unfiltered sound of 300 people who had just witnessed something they would never forget, and knew it. Vivian Caldwell's hands were shaking as she typed. Her thread went live before Delilah reached the door. Within 2 hours, the video had 400,000 views. By morning, 12 million. One hashtag climbed through the noise, rising above every caption and comment and repost like a signal fire. Hashtag, she played anyway. The service door closed behind her and the noise disappeared. Outside, the alley behind the Drake Hotel smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. A delivery truck idled at the far end. A kitchen worker leaned against the wall smoking a cigarette, not knowing that 10 feet away stood a girl who had just made 300 billionaires cry. Delilah leaned against the brick wall. Her hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, from release. The kind of shaking that comes when the adrenaline drains and your body finally understands what just happened. She pressed Ida's gloves against her face and breathed in. The yarn still smelled faintly of lavender and coffee. 2 years, and it still smelled like home. Footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful. Nathan Holloway came through the service door, slightly out of breath. He still had his bow tie on. His eyes were red. He didn't say anything dramatic, didn't give a speech. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a business card, and held it out to her. I teach at a community music school on the west side. We have 3 grand pianos. Practice rooms open until midnight. He paused. You need a piano to practice on? Come by any time. No charge. No strings. Delilah looked at the card, looked at him. Her lips pressed together, the way people's mouths tighten when they're trying not to cry again. Why? Nathan smiled, tired, real. Because I sat at that bench tonight and did nothing while a man threw bread at your feet. This is the least I can do. She took the card. Then Terry Adams appeared at the service entrance. He'd been waiting there the whole time. Hadn't gone inside, hadn't watched the performance, had just stood in the cold Chicago night, trusting that Delilah would walk back out. He saw her face. He didn't ask what happened. He just opened his arms. Delilah broke. The dam that had held through the insult, through the dare, through 8 minutes of Chopin and a mic drop line delivered to a billionaire's face, it collapsed. She buried her face in Terry's shoulder and sobbed. Deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body. The kind of crying that doesn't come from sadness. It comes from 2 years of carrying something too heavy and finally being allowed to set it down. Terry held her, didn't say a word, just held her until the shaking slowed. Then quietly, Ida would have raised the roof tonight, Dee. That made her cry harder, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that heals. 48 hours later, the world had shifted. The video didn't just go viral, it detonated. 12 million views became 30 million. 30 became 50. Every news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The story was everywhere. The homeless girl, the billionaire, the bread roll, the Steinway, 3 notes that stopped a room. And the dominoes began to fall. The Chicago Conservatory of Music contacted Delilah directly, not through the normal application process, not through the wait list. The dean herself called the shelter and asked to speak with her. For the first time in the conservatory's history, they invited a candidate to bypass the preliminary round entirely. Full scholarship, 4 years, effective immediately. Professor Elaine Mercer saw the video on Thursday morning. Her neighbor sent her the link. She watched it once, then again. Then a third time, pausing at the moment Delilah's left hand found its rhythm at bar 42. The exact transition Mercer had drilled into her 1,000 times in that tiny apartment on the south side. She called the shelter. Her voice cracked on the first sentence. 2 years without a piano and she played like that. I didn't teach her that. That's something God put in her hands. She insisted on resuming lessons immediately. Free, no discussion. A private foundation, not Whitfield's, reached out through Terry Adams. They offered Delilah stable housing and a monthly living stipend through the duration of her studies. A real apartment, a real address, a door with a lock and a key that belonged to her. Gus Brennan, the diner owner, saw the video on his phone during the lunch rush. He watched it twice, standing in the kitchen doorway, towel over his shoulder. The quiet girl who washed dishes every night, the one who never complained, the one whose name he barely used because he never thought to ask her story. He called her that evening. His voice was rough. "You could have told me, kid." Delilah was quiet for a moment. Then, "You never asked. But you always paid on time. That mattered more than you know." Gus didn't say anything for a long time after that. When he hung up, he stood in his empty diner and stared at the dish station where she worked every night. The steel sink, the rubber gloves, the stack of plates. And understood for the first time that he had been standing next to something extraordinary and never once looked up. Carlton Whitfield issued a public apology 72 hours after the video went live. It was 4 paragraphs long, written by his PR team, reviewed by his lawyers. It used the phrase "deeply regret" twice and "committed to growth" 3 times. It mentioned Delilah by name, but never once used the word sorry. The internet didn't buy it. The comment sections buried him. His foundation's major donors began pulling out, quietly at first, then publicly. 2 board members resigned within the week. The Earn Your Place banners came down from his website. No one replaced them with anything. The narrator doesn't need to tell you what happened to Carlton Whitfield. Men like him don't collapse overnight. They erode, slowly, the way a crack in a foundation spreads, invisible at first, then everywhere. But this story was never about him. The bread roll he tossed at Delilah's feet? Someone at the gala picked it up that night and placed it on the piano. It sat there until the staff cleared the ballroom, next to the fingerless gloves Delilah had briefly removed to play. Nobody moved either one. As if the room understood, without being told, that those 2 objects belong together now. A monument to what arrogance costs and what dignity survives. 3 weeks later, a practice room at the Chicago Conservatory of Music, late afternoon. Golden light pouring through tall windows, falling across a polished grand piano in long, warm stripes. Sheet music on the stand, a metronome on the shelf, silent. Delilah sat at the bench. Her posture was different now. Not the hunched, invisible posture of the shelter. Straight, open, the posture of someone who had earned her seat and knew it. She was wearing the fingerless gloves, not because she needed them for warmth, because Ida was part of every note she would ever play, and she wanted her close. She placed her fingers on the keys. The opening of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, G, B-flat, D, 3 notes. This time, her hands didn't tremble. This time, she smiled before she began. Delilah didn't walk into that ballroom to prove anything to Carlton Whitfield. She walked in to prove something to herself, that she was still the girl her grandmother raised. 2 years of washing dishes and sleeping in shelters hadn't taken that from her, and nothing ever will. Talent doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't need a dress code, a zip code, or a billionaire's approval. It just needs a chance. And sometimes, 3 notes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and hit the bell, because every week we bring you a new story about someone the world underestimated. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged before you had a chance to show who you really are? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one.
3 notes. 3 notes from a girl in a donated dress and torn sneakers. And 300 of the most powerful people in Chicago forgot how to breathe. Carlton Whitfield had everything. The money, the stage, the room. He threw bread at her feet and said, "Your kind doesn't belong here." He thought power was something you buy. But Delilah sat down at that standway with hands scarred from 2 years of dish soap and steel wool. And she reminded every person in that room what real power sounds like. It doesn't wear a Tom Ford suit. It doesn't need a last name. Ida Brooks raised that girl on a judge piano with a chipped middle C. And 2 years after losing everything, Delilah proved that what Ida planted in her couldn't be washed away. Not by grief, not by poverty, and definitely not by a man with a bread roll and an ego. Now be real with me. Have you ever walked into a room where somebody decided, before you even opened your mouth, that you didn't belong? A job interview, a classroom, or a family dinner. What did you do? Did you leave? Or did you sit down at the piano anyway? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, hit that bell. Every week we bring you a story the world tries to silence. And remember, talent doesn't need a dress code. It just needs 3 notes and the courage to play anyway.